I didn't know whether there was a legal workaround before the inspection window until the silence in our house got loud enough to hear the clock ticking. The repairs were half finished, the permits sat neatly clipped, and the association's latest message had frozen everything in place. The light from the kitchen window felt colder than usual, like winter sun that doesn't warm anything. I could sense that this wasn't about safety or compliance anymore, it was about control. Somewhere inside that paperwork was a pressure point, and I intended to find it before the window slammed shut. I'm telling this as it unfolded for me, because the first moments matter. The way the rules were presented, the way the language was chosen, the way the timing felt engineered. The board didn't shout. They didn't threaten. They simply paused us mid-repair and said we'd be reviewed during the inspection window. That phrase landed like a door locking behind us. It was subtle, bureaucratic, and effective. The stress didn't come from noise, it came from waiting. I had heard stories like this before, the kind people file away as HOA nightmare warnings they never expect to live through. I always thought those stories relied on hot-headed arguments or reckless choices. What I learned is that the quiet version is worse. When a committee knows the rules better than you do, and they slow time itself, panic sets in quickly. The house creaked as the evening cooled, and the smell of sawdust from halted work hung in the air. That was the moment I decided to document everything. This wasn't revenge yet. It was survival. The opening move was understanding how the board could halt us without issuing a single fine or notice. The answer was timing. Timing wrapped in policy language. Timing that created pressure without fingerprints. And if timing was their weapon, it could become mine too. The background matters, because nothing happens in a vacuum. We moved into the community years earlier, drawn by the promise of maintained spaces and quiet streets. The association's rules were thick but readable, and at first they felt reasonable. Over time, a pattern emerged. The same board members rotated positions. The same interpretations appeared whenever a homeowner pushed the edges of allowed repairs. I noticed it the way you notice weather patterns, not alarming at first, just repetitive. Our project was ordinary. Structural repairs after a slow leak had damaged part of the interior. We followed the process, submitted plans, waited for approval, and received it. The approval letter sat in a clear sleeve on my desk, edges crisp, signature legible. Then, halfway through the work, an email arrived stating that an inspection would be required before continuation. The tone was polite. The timing was surgical. The association cited CCR Section 4.3 mailbox rule as justification for pausing activity pending review. That line mattered. It was an evidence prop I highlighted immediately because it governed notice delivery and response timing. The board hadn't accused us of a violation. They simply invoked procedure. Outside, a lawn sprinkler clicked rhythmically as if nothing had changed. Inside, everything had. I tried to view it charitably. Maybe they needed confirmation. Maybe this was routine. But when I asked for clarification, the response looped back to the same phrase. Inspection window. No dates, no specifics, just a reminder that work could not proceed until completion of the review. It felt less like oversight and more like leverage. The stress crept into daily life. Every unfinished surface felt accusatory. Tools sat unused. Friends asked why the repairs were stalled, and I gave vague answers. Social pressure is a quiet force, and the board knew that. They didn't need to shame us publicly, the pause did that on its own. The air in the house smelled faintly of paint that would never dry. I started a folder labeled board correspondence and dropped in every email, every attachment, every timestamp. Another folder held the bylaws, bookmarked and annotated. This was the first stage of an HOA revenge story, though I didn't know it yet. It wasn't loud or flashy. It was meticulous. The conflict rose without a single raised voice. Weeks earlier, I'd noticed a neighbor's project sail through approvals despite similar scope. The difference wasn't the work, it was the relationship. Patterns like that don't prove anything on their own, but they inform strategy. I began to chart timelines, comparing response delays across projects. The sound of a distant leaf blower drifted through an open window, grounding me while I worked. The board's behavior tightened. Follow-up emails reiterated the pause. Each message arrived late in the day, compressing my response time without technically shortening it. That's when I recognized the shape of the trap. By controlling when communication landed, they controlled when the inspection window effectively applied. It was procedural, clean, and deeply frustrating. I reminded myself this was fictionalized and not legal advice, but understanding process is different from practicing law. I wasn't looking to break rules, I was looking to use them correctly. The bylaws were clear about notice requirements and review periods. They were less clear about indefinite pauses. That ambiguity was the board's playground. If they could freeze a family with silence, what else could they stall before the inspection window closed? I gathered evidence calmly. A board agenda excerpt from the previous month referenced inspection scheduling protocols, including language about reasonable timelines. That mattered. It suggested standards the board claimed to follow. The rain tapped lightly against the roof as I printed it, a steady reminder that time was passing whether the board acknowledged it or not. I wasn't ready to confront anyone. Not yet. The opening act was about preparation, not retaliation. I needed to understand how pressure worked here, how the association applied it without overt action. The repairs would wait. The strategy couldn't. The pause dragged on, and that's where the real damage happened. Not to the walls or the flooring, but to routines. Morning light came through half-covered windows, catching dust motes that shouldn't have been there anymore. Every day the unfinished repairs reminded us we were stuck, and every day the board said nothing new. Silence can be an action when it's deliberate. I stopped assuming good faith and started testing assumptions. The association's rules talked about inspections as checkpoints, not barricades. The word freeze never appeared. That gap mattered. I created a timeline spreadsheet that tracked every interaction, including when messages were sent, when they were received under the CCR Section 4.3 mailbox rule, and when responses were due. It was boring work, the kind that doesn't feel like progress until it suddenly is. The committee's pattern sharpened. They acknowledged receipt quickly but delayed substance. Each acknowledgement reset anxiety without advancing anything. The sound of a delivery truck backing up outside became a metronome for my patience. I realized the board wasn't waiting on information, they were waiting on us to flinch. That's how power works when it's petty and procedural. I requested the inspection schedule politely, citing the agenda excerpt that referenced reasonable timelines. The response came back with familiar phrasing and no schedule. The inspection window remained undefined. Undefined is powerful. Undefined lets the association say everything and nothing at once. By now, neighbors noticed. Side glances during evening walks, casual questions about whether we were okay. Social pressure rose, not from the board directly, but from the community's curiosity. That's a feature, not a bug, in homeowners association drama. The board doesn't need to embarrass you publicly when uncertainty does it for them. I resisted the urge to explain myself widely. Information control mattered. Instead, I focused on internal clarity. The bylaws included a clause about selective enforcement, buried and rarely cited. It didn't accuse anyone, it set a standard. I printed it and placed it behind the approval letter in my folder. Evidence props don't shout, they wait. The repairs themselves began to suffer. Materials aged. Temporary fixes became semi-permanent. The house sounded different at night, settling in ways it shouldn't have. That's when frustration threatened to turn reckless. I stepped back and reminded myself that retaliation would come later, and it would be procedural. Every delay cost something, and I wondered how much pressure they expected us to absorb before the inspection window became a weapon. I sent a second request, this time framed as a confirmation of timelines under existing protocols. Still calm, still factual. The board's reply cited workload and reiterated the pause. No violation, no deadline, just waiting. That was the moment the conflict tipped from annoyance into strategy. Escalation didn't arrive with fireworks, it arrived with paperwork. A notice appeared in the portal reminding homeowners to maintain compliance during reviews. It wasn't addressed to us specifically, but the timing was unmistakable. The hum of the refrigerator filled the kitchen as I read it twice. This was pressure by implication. I compared that notice to others archived online. Same template, different timing. The pattern was clear now. The board used broad reminders to narrow targets. It created plausible deniability while tightening the noose. This was no longer just our problem, it was a method. I responded with documentation. I attached the original approval, cited the agenda excerpt again, and asked for confirmation that the pause complied with the association's own stated standards. The reply took longer than usual. Silence stretched. That delay was information. When a board goes quiet after being cornered by its own rules, something shifts beneath the inspection window. The response finally came, carefully worded, acknowledging the concern without resolving it. They promised to review internally. That phrase landed differently now. Review internally meant they were talking about us without us. I'd prepared for that. Up to this point, the board had frozen repairs by exploiting timing and silence during the inspection window. I countered by documenting patterns, citing their own protocols, and refusing to panic, turning their delays into a record of overreach. The first crack appeared quietly. A new agenda posted for the next meeting included a generic item about inspection procedures. No names, no addresses, but the language mirrored my concerns. The fluorescent light in my office flickered as I read it, and I smiled for the first time in weeks. This was movement. I didn't celebrate. I prepared. I drafted a concise statement referencing the selective enforcement clause and the undefined pause. I didn't plan to speak yet, I planned to submit it as part of the record. Timing mattered more than volume. If they were rewriting procedure to save face, how far would they go to protect the inspection window? I sent the statement just before the submission cutoff, ensuring it landed within the mailbox rule timeframe. The board acknowledged receipt. No commentary. That was fine. The trap wasn't sprung yet. It was set. The repairs still waited. The house still felt unfinished. But the balance had shifted. The board was no longer simply pausing us, they were reacting. And reaction is the first step toward losing control. The retaliation phase didn't begin with confrontation, it began with precision. I treated every message like a chess move, waiting for the moment the board's own process boxed them in. The house was quiet except for the low whir of the heater, and that steadiness helped me stay calm. I submitted a follow-up referencing the newly posted agenda item, asking how the updated inspection procedures would apply to projects already approved and paused. This time, the response was faster. Not helpful, but faster. Speed told me the pressure had reversed. They couldn't pretend this was routine anymore. I added that reply to the folder, noting how quickly it arrived compared to earlier delays. Patterns are persuasive when they're documented. I also sent a courtesy note to the association's management channel, not accusing anyone, just asking for clarification on implementation consistency. It was a procedural nudge, nothing more. But it expanded the audience. The board preferred narrow rooms and quiet pauses. This widened the hallway. When process becomes public, legal consequences start to whisper before the inspection window even opens. The next agenda dropped with subtle changes. Language tightened. Vague phrases about pauses were replaced with defined review steps. No admission of error, but the shift was unmistakable. The board was retrofitting policy to escape its own ambiguity. The light outside turned amber as evening settled, and I printed the agenda excerpt, highlighting the revisions. I submitted one final document, a request to proceed based on the clarified steps, noting that our project already satisfied them. I attached everything: approval letter, timeline spreadsheet, correspondence logs. It wasn't aggressive. It was complete. Completion is hard to ignore. The association replied with a confirmation that the inspection would occur promptly. No apology, no explanation, just movement. The freeze thawed because the board needed it to. That's how retaliation works when it's lawful and patient. The inspection itself was anticlimactic. A walkthrough, a checklist, a signature. Sunlight streamed through the windows, finally touching the unfinished surfaces. The pause before and after felt longer than the inspection, a brief silence where I wondered if they'd find another procedural lever. They didn't. The real climax wasn't the inspection, it was the follow-up notice. It confirmed continuation without conditions. That line mattered. It closed the loop they tried to keep open. I filed it carefully, knowing it would matter later. This was the satisfying part of the HOA versus homeowner arc. Not because anyone was punished, but because the tactic failed. The board's method relied on homeowners giving up under uncertainty. We didn't. The repairs resumed, tools humming back to life, the house sounding normal again. Aftermath came quietly. The board's communications shifted tone, more formal, less elastic. Future notices included clearer timelines. Neighbors mentioned smoother approvals. I never claimed credit publicly. The record spoke for itself. The cost was stress and time, but the benefit was precedent. I reflected on how close this had come to becoming a full HOA nightmare. Not through fines or shouting, but through waiting. Power doesn't always yell. Sometimes it just stalls. The lesson wasn't about winning. It was about refusing to disappear inside a pause. If this inspection freeze felt familiar, please like, share, subscribe, turn on notifications, and comment your own HOA battles below so others can learn. And thanks for watching this deep dive into timing, pressure, and patience. Next time, I'll share another story where timing becomes a weapon, but the stakes move from repairs to reputation, and the board underestimates how quickly a quiet record can turn the tables.